Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, my talk will touch a little bit on policy. Um, I've got quite a few slides, so I'll go through them very quickly. In many cases, I won't explain the data. I'll just make a statement about what the data mean. Hold on tight. Trust me. I do. I think I can say what the data mean. So the title is The Challenge of Increasing Legume Production on European Farms. And I want to first start with some background information about the backdrop to the development of legumes in Europe. And it can be boiled down um, to an awareness using the words of Wendell Berry, an awareness of how we eat determines to a considerable extent how the world is used. So there's a growing awareness in Europe that this is true, and the result is people are becoming more interested in how we produce and consume our foods. And one of the key factors in a sustainable food system would be the use of legumes. This is due to many reasons, but often people overlook the fact that legumes have a major role in mitigating the effects of the nitrogen cycle, how we've distorted the nitrogen cycle over the years. Nitrogen is the most exceeded planetary boundary, and there's few places in the world where an awareness of that where there's an awareness of that greater than in Europe. So European policymakers have been focused on nitrogen, and the result of their focus on nitrogen and their efforts to control nitrogen emissions is a farmer protest over the last few years, starting in the Netherlands. And this is I took this photograph in Texel, on the island of Texel in the Netherlands, where farmers were protesting against policymakers who are trying to reduce nitrogen impacts. And what the sign says is stop the nitrogen madness. And I have to say that we can all agree with this. Those protesting and those they are protesting against can all agree that it's time to stop the nitrogen madness. And legumes play a role in stopping the nitrogen madness of importing a huge amount of protein into Europe and turning it into meat and some dairy products to an excess that makes us ill. So it all happens. The development of legumes is being advanced in a framework, an understanding of agri-food systems and the role of legumes in them. So what has happened? Well, this is a chart of the growth in the meat production and actually consumption at the same time since 1961. The black line is the growth in the net import of soybean, and the red line is the production of legumes in Europe. The dotted line, black line, is the use of nitrogen fertilizer. So it's very clear that there is a connection between how we consume, how we choose to consume protein and the deficit of protein that we have causing the imports, mostly from South America. Legume production in Europe has declined over the years and is now reached the level, is stabilized at about 2 to 3% of the arable area. And you can see the decline here in the various crops. The major trends are a decline in phasolus bean, and in recent years an increase in soybean, with peas showing a boost in the 80s and 90s and a decline since. That contrasts with the production of the grain cereals. So the wheat on the blue line at the top, barley in the middle, and other crops. So they have been fairly steady through this period while the legumes have declined. So what has happened? Well, here are the data for the yield of wheat um, in France since 1961, compared with the yield of pea in the same country and soybean. And what you can see is that since 1961, the yield of wheat has tripled. This is due to the combination of genetic improvement, especially the semi-dwarf gene and the increased harvest index associated with the semi-dwarf gene. Whereas in comparison, the pea has rose a bit and then declined again, and soybean has remained relatively constant at about 2 tons per hectare. If you turn those data into the price of producing a crop of soybean or pea in relation to wheat, you can see here the green line. The green line tracks the amount of wheat that the farmer would get per ton of soybean grown in France, and the same with the blue line is the amount of wheat that the farmer would have grown instead of pea over the same period. And what you can see is this is really a measure of the competitiveness of wheat compared with soybean and pea. You can see that the competitiveness of wheat in relation to soybean has remained relatively steady at 2.7 tons of wheat per ton of soybean, and pea has declined. The competitiveness of wheat has increased against pea. So in other words, it's bad for pea over the years. And that is, in a nutshell, why farmers, why we have a deficit of legume crops in Europe. We are extremely good at growing wheat, barley, oilseed rape, and similar crops. This is due to our location it's due to the fact that we have a high latitude and we have mild winters. And the combination of high latitude and mild winters makes these crops very, very productive. Doing the same thing with the United Kingdom, comparing wheat, pea, and faba bean, you see the same pattern with wheat in the United Kingdom. And you can see that over the years, pea and faba bean have remained relatively steady. It's amazing that so little progress has been made with pea and faba bean in Britain, at least according to these FAO average yield data. And the effect on the competitiveness, yes, you can see the competitiveness of wheat against those two crops has increased steadily. So as far as the challenge of increasing the production of pea and of legumes, grain legumes is concerned in Europe, we can see from these two countries, and it's pattern would be similar elsewhere. We can see that since 1961, the changes and the technological progress that has been made means that these legume crops have become less competitive against the crops that farmers prefer to grow. And so we have to take a look at what this means for trade. So here is the data for the production of wheat and pea in Canada and Germany, the yield of wheat and pea in Canada and Germany, the wheat yield at the top, and the three other yields are more or less the same. So the yield of pea is similar in Canada and Germany, and similar also to wheat in Canada. So what does that mean? An economist would immediately say that means trade. No matter how good we are at producing pea, how high the yields of pea might be in Europe, a pattern like that means trade because of the comparative advantage of wheat. You see the same here for wheat in France in relation to America, exactly the same. This difference, this comparative advantage of wheat, no matter how high the yields of soybean in France might be compared with other places, the fact that the French are so good at growing wheat means that wheat will be grown instead of soybean. And to understand that, why does trade happen? You need to read David Ricardo. And I would say to anybody who's interested in legumes and protein and all of these matters in Europe, that if they really want to understand it from an economic and policies perspective, they go and read David Ricardo, the classic economist. He lived around in the 18th century, and he explained why trade happens. And trade not only happens between countries, it also happens within countries and within value chains. And I think that the legume community, if you like, the protein community in Europe, tends to forget that farmers trade. They trade for their inputs, they trade their outputs, and the trade happens right up to the consumer. That means that there is market forces operating all along the line. And these market forces are sometimes, it's advocated that you can sort of switch them off and you can create added value, but they eventually kick back in. So the question then is what happens in these markets if we somehow force an increase in the production of these grain legume crops instead of the crops that farmers prefer to grow? And I did an exercise in Legume Translated. I looked at the data, FAO stat data again, and I did some sums. And basically what it showed was that if we replaced our common crops with some legumes, a threefold increase and a fivefold increase, the fivefold increase would have led to a 10% use of legumes in cropping systems, we would see an increase in protein production and we would see a decrease in energy. And the result would be, using the assumptions here, that the land area that Europe needs to produce its food would actually increase. That means we would be importing more land rather than less. Now, this is a particular set of calculations, but what they illustrate is the policy risk associated with dabbling in these markets. And the policy risk is that you actually make some of the things that we're trying to address worse. Research done in Legumes Translated, which looked at the same question at the level of individual rotations, came up with a broadly similar answer. Increasing legumes increases protein production, reduces nitrogen use, obviously, but results in a reduction in the energy output of European agriculture. And that reduction in energy output of European agriculture would mean that Europe, which now exports cereals, would be exporting less cereal product, mainly to Northern Africa. And that missing cereal would have to be met by production elsewhere. So, there are risks with dabbling with these markets, and that these matters have to be taken very carefully. Why is this? The reason for it is that, as shown in this graph, that if you look at the biological productivity of different crops in Europe, as these French researchers did, you can see, and you turn the yield into carbohydrate or photosynthate. The amount of photosynthate needed to produce fat is high. That for protein is quite high. And of course, for carbohydrate, it's low. So when you compare the performance of crops in relation to the photosynthate and the resource that they capture, you see, and turn that into isoproductive lines. These are lines which represent the same level of productivity between crops. You can see that maize is at the top, wheat is second in the second rank, and then the other crops are lower down. And the legumes tend to be lower down. That means they are, for whatever reason, they are intrinsically, biologically less productive in many European environments compared with wheat and maize. And the challenge is to change that. So what are the crops that we're talking about? I've described them here in this diagram. They are cool season and warm season crops, fine seeded, oil rich, carbohydrate rich. Warm season are carbohydrate rich and oil rich. And the result is these different crop species and their uses. This is a useful sort of scheme to understand the various crops and the differences between them. And it's fascinating, actually, when I did this, is to see the connection between how we use crops and the connection between crops in terms of their use and the connection between crops in terms of their evolution. And so the crops split into two groups. The peas and faba bean germinate below ground, and soybean and lupins germinate above ground, and those who germinate above ground are very vulnerable to damage. And the top 10 crops are faba bean, pea, soybean, with a lot of biological resources available to us from China, as you can see in the right-hand side. Lupin, chickpea, lentil, the phasolus beans, a huge variation in these and a very important food crop and part of European cuisine. Vetches have a niche role in some places. And of course, there's lucerne for the forages. Lucerne is a perennial forage used for feeding cattle. And the clovers, of course, that fit into our pasture systems and are the cornerstone of sustainable pasture production. There is a challenge, of course, if you want to lift the performance of these crops faster than the performance of the other competing crops, you need to use plant breeding. And this is a scheme for plant breeding of inbred crops. They're all inbred crops. And what do breeders do? They generate variation. They cross parents. They select parents, first of all, generate variation in the progeny. They stabilize the progeny so that they are pure breeding, and eventually they test the products, the most promising lines in field selection programs.
Donald,
Yeah.
we are about time. Can you
Okay.
wrap it up?
Yeah, I can. I'll just go
Thank you.
through. This breeding business, well, we've been breeding we've been breeding for a defect elimination rather than for yield, is my argument. We need to switch to breed for yield and learn from wheat and maize, how the breeders of wheat and maize have made progress using crop physiology. And priority number one would be winter hardiness for some crops. We need to read John Monteith. Targets for climate change are becoming clear, but it's very difficult to predict. Responding to climate change will happen almost automatically within the breeding community. We need to do all of this with a strategy. I've worked with Donal Soy to produce this strategy for protein. We need to do everything with a strategy in Europe for protein, not just protein crops. We need deep long-term partnerships between academia and breeders. This all can be read in this article. And so I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can also make your PowerPoint available if
Yes.
that would be okay.
Yeah.
I can share it with everyone. That was a great presentation. And if anyone has questions, please just send them in the chat that we're going to address them by the end of the meeting. Now we have Claude Rubyogo speaking. He's the Global Bean Program Leader and Director of the Pan-Africa Bean Research Alliance, PABRA, and a specialist in crop improvement and seed systems. He has pioneered demand-led approaches that have reached over 42 million smallholder farmers, most of them women, across 31 African countries. Under his leadership, PABRA has built transformative partnerships to boost bean productivity, marketing, and consumption, earning major recognitions such as the 2023 Africa Food Prize and the AI Summit Prize for African Development. His work continues to link research, innovation, and practice for lasting food security. Welcome, Jean-Claude.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I'm in a meeting. I hope in case of any noise, you'll bear with me. Are you able to get me well?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Okay, yeah, I'm very sorry. We're in a meeting in Dakar, and there are very less room where you can have a good place. Yeah. So anyway, so I'll be discussing with you on the beans journey of transformation of the common beans in Africa, which is again, it's a matter of really orienting our research toward the demand, but also engaging with the policymakers so that they can really invest in this crop as well. So it's implication of research and also I wanted to reduce this.
Do you help?
I'm trying to reduce this size. Okay, yeah. So let's look at probably the beans as a crop. Traditionally, it's grown by women for home use. That's how it was before we embark on this journey. And it was perceived to be poor man's crop. So you don't have alternative, you don't have meat. So that's a crop you eat. And then there was a limited market access and the policy support. That's in the last maybe in early, even up to 2000 as well, earlier than that. So, and there was a very little investment in research in this crop. So what happened, what are the drivers of the change, which we needed to develop and people to understand? There's urbanization and a changing diet. It's not just rural area, people want healthy food. Everywhere they see beans now as a crop, as a food, which is we can solve several plant proteins, but also cultural. They want to keep their culture. So there's a changing diet, even if we're going through urbanization as well. There's also increasingly beans seen as an alternative in the school feeding. So that's really people see it, quality beans, high iron beans to increase the nutrition of the school children, particularly the high the micronutrients dense. But also there is a regional market, both regional and export, which is growing, either outside. I think what my colleague talked about, trade. Trade is very, very important. And then SMEs and farmers say, wow, this is an opportunity to increase incomes. So you are really seeing the transformation based also on the demand, and the research cannot sit idle, continue doing the way they are doing. We had really to adapt. So we developed a system of what we call corridor, is to understand how the market works, what drives it, what are type of beans the market is interested in. So that's when we develop a variety, we can know how do we target that variety, product profile of the variety. It's really to understand the consumer. So, and then how does it move at the country level and cross region? Because in East Africa, there is a market which for beans is cut from one region to the other, one country to the other. So like Tanzania growing the yellow, going to Kenya, maybe small red from Ethiopia coming to Kenya, and then so forth. As you can see from this map, you can really see various market type. So they also cross the countries very easily. So this is again where we invested to understand the consumer, the trader, and the trading pattern of beans in the region and the countries. And then from there, we develop really what we can call our Bible in terms of doing our work. So we developed the bean commodity corridor, which allows us to understand all this. We documented it, is on website. It's really think as the demand-led and participatory, my stakeholder approach for bean research and development, of course, to add the value, to incentivize the farmer, to incentivize the trader, but also to give the right products, to get the right products to the consumer. So we documented this in this as well. So that bean corridor can be seen here on diagram as really to understand the consumer, the market, the processing, the buying, as you can see from this. And then you go to the production hubs. You target the variety. That is, you have a product, you have a variety profile, product profile development, and then you can, once you get that product profile, you develop based on that. You have a seed system to respond to the need and develop agronomy. And then you work with the grain traders, that they are part of our research agenda, the distribution hub, the aggregation, the distribution hub. And then we bring in other enabling conditions like really building resilience, policy support, gender mainstreaming, inclusivity, again, ICT for efficiency, and then putting the message of nutrition as very key. So really looking on how does research transform the local and the regional economies through this demand-led breeding, variety development, and then based on market segmentation, and then that market segmentation help us to develop the variety which are looking for by the market. So let's say at the community level, how do we operate? This diagram just gives you again an idea that yes, the driver is a market and is led by a lead partner we call off-taker, can be a grain trader, can be a processor, will be linked to farm business organization. These are farmers who are producing the beans for their own household consumption, but also for the market. And then research comes in as a demand to respond to their demand. So research is not the one driving the products without engaging with the market. So we respond and we anticipate with the demand led, which brings in to support this consortium of the farmer who is pulled by the lead partner. And then we have the market information. We have the knowledge to support this consortium and this partnership and ecosystem, input supply, extension services, but geared toward making sure that the right product is available at the farmer produce the right product and they're linked to the market, and the market pays them and incentivize them for continuous production, and then they can really adopt a good agricultural practice. So again, our breeding, for that to happen, it went through looking on various traits, which will be certainly very important for the farmer. The farmer is interested in the productivity, in the yield. So you need to look at the factors limiting the yield to push the yield higher. Look at the climate-related issue, drought, heat. Look at soil adaptation, farming system. So the variety we develop should be really early maturing because of time of drought and in time. So you really need to have the right variety which fits in the growing period. Climbing beans for land is constraint, where land is constraint, and then we work also in the context of the communities. Very important for the farmer to get a better yield. But also, we don't ignore, very important, the consumer trait. It's not that production trait we need to develop, but also the consumer trait, the grain quality, the preferred market type, the slower darkening, the fresh grain quality, the culinary quality, cooking time, processing quality for the zone processing. So there's the taste, all that as well. You can really see how the market in East Africa will be differentiated. This is a market in Tanzania showing how. So we follow, our breeding has really to follow this demand as well. We're able to release the variety in the region, as you can see from here. Again, some country have some variety have multiple release that allows the regional trade, very important, so that you create economy of scale in terms of variety, but also the country which does not have release a seed can get from another variety and jumpstart the process. And then the regionally, we have some traders who are regional, like you can see from this graph. So off-takers in Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda, who work regionally. And us as a PABRA and SEAT bean team will be able to support them to get the right variety for their market, to optimize the quality they are looking for of the seed, training on pre and post harvest management, mechanization where necessary, and then climate information. And we have also room for the banks to finance this ecosystem through, like in East Africa, we have M-Pesa, which is a digital money paying. We have digital companies coming in to make, that's how it works at the regional as well as the national level. And this have seen investment of the seed companies. I can see from here how the companies have been increasing, the small, medium enterprise, the farmer groups investing in seed. So this has also allowed us to increase the seed available to the farmer. So this graph again gives how we have been able to reach a good number of farmers who have access to this variety and increase their productivity, but based on their demand. So we're able to really, now they buy seed. So this is just an example how many varieties we have released in the region for the last closer to 30 years now, across 31 countries, and then number of farmers reached. And then also out, in addition to the variety now, we have also other services which support the community, which increase the productivity. You can see mechanization. We help them to look at it. How do you, rather than using old way of broadcasting, if you're able to optimize the density population, I mean, you can see the yield is different from 0.4 to 110.5. But also post-harvest management and processing beans into good quality grain using threshers, and which can be transported on a motorbike. That's a company we trained. And this helps us to create jobs and employment for the youth as well. So this has seen a productivity increase in the region, because not only for the genetics, which has been improved, and agronomy, but also incentive to the farmer. Because the farmer, to invest in a good quality seed, to invest in agronomy, they need market incentive. They need a better price so that they can buy input, they can take care of their crop, they can weed on time, they can plant on time. So what you can see here in Uganda, the yield has gone up, Tanzania, Ethiopia, but we still have some countries where we need to do a good work, as you can see from there. Zambia is going up, but not as high. Rwanda is still not good. Malawi is going up, but not as the other three countries where the market has really been very fully developed. So they also contribute to the national economies. As you can see, economic growth in Uganda. Beans used to be a small crop, 10 million in 2010 for the regional trade. Now it's going to up to 132 million, next to maybe fish and coffee, overtaking maize as well. So that shows how beans play a role. This is again in Ethiopia, where they contribute to job creation in terms of beans. Ethiopia export around $120 million per year of white pea bean, and you can see how they're able to transform the job creation, create a business opportunity, which again created jobs. So it becomes very important. So again, on the policy, what are the implications? Because the research really have seen, the government have seen that this crop is useful for nutrition, for incomes, for economic growth, for good soil ecosystem. They are willing to invest. But also we had the national policy we work with, particularly school feeding. We have been able to, the last 2024 alone, engaging with the policy, who are engaging policymakers in school feeding, 2.7 million children accessing high on beans, but also engaging with the countries to see how they can invest in their research. We have a long way, but it's happening. Also, at the regional level, work with the seed harmonization policy, very, very important as well, so that they can really harmonize seed moving from one country to the other. And then we also have been working with the beans is how, which I think other colleagues will talk about it, how do we promote the beans consumption across? So we did engage with the both country and at the global level. So is that an example from Rwanda, where we really engaged with the government recently, and they would like to invest further in beans. We have done it in Uganda. We're going to do it in Ethiopia. We also done it in Angola. We also don't want to see the government prioritizing this crop where they haven't done. So in terms of policy transformation, we're able to do. In summary, we were able to engage with the national policy makers and prioritize beans and investment in bean research. We want to do more. This can be even done, happen. Seed harmonization at the level, at the regional level, in East Africa, in COMESA and SADC region, there's a regional economic blocks. Better nutrition policies, again, like school feeding, we've been able to do that. Trade policies, but also as a climate smart, because we've got a variety of 65 days, 70 days, disease tolerant, and very good for water use. So that's, again, beans can be integrating the national agricultural policy. So for this, again, PABRA was recognized as a very contributor to food security. We got a prize 2019, and then Africa Food Prize 2023, as you can see from this slide. So these are the major contributor of this, the national government, the Gates Foundation, Australians, the Canadians as well, the USA when it was still functional, the Swiss, and also the as well as also the CGR as well. So the national government plays a role. So that's what I want to share with you. It has been a journey of transformation, but which is rewarding. And more is needed because we really need to move again, as my colleague indicated. How do you move from that yield of 1.5 to 2 tons to push at the 3? So there is a really good work which can be done in terms of productivity and increasing the genetics and good agronomy and incentive of the market. So thank you very much. And yeah, if there's any question, I'll be able to answer. I'm in a meeting, may not have much time to stay, but at least I'll be there for the next 20 minutes if there's any question on the chat. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. We're moving along now to Asma Lateef. She's Chief of Policy and Advocacy Impact at the SDG2 Advocacy Hub with a long career advancing global food security and nutrition. She previously directed the Bread for the World Institute, led the Alliance to End Hunger, and played a key role in establishing the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, serving on its executive committee. Earlier, she worked with the International Labour Organization and the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and she has been deeply involved in policy initiatives from the Millennium Challenge Corporation to international nutrition coalitions. Welcome, Asma.
Thank you so much. And it's great. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this conversation. I've been involved in many efforts over the years, and the focus on beans touches upon so many aspects of SDG2. So for those who are unfamiliar, let me just start with a quick description of the SDG2 Advocacy Hub. We were created just after the adoption of the global goal to end hunger, SDG2, to really foster coordination and a collaboration to keep the momentum on SDG2. And obviously, over the last few years, we've seen huge headwinds in terms of hunger, malnutrition, agriculture. So one of the things we're trying through our partnerships is to focus on those sort of win-win solutions. And as you all know, beans are very much at the heart of that. So next slide, please, sorry. So as Jean-Claude mentioned, and he's been a huge champion and partner on this, a few years ago, we launched the Beans is How campaign. The campaign is aimed at doubling bean consumption with a recognition that it touches many aspects of the global goals, including SDG2. It's critical for nutrition outcomes. It's really important for farmer livelihoods and productivity. It's essential for agricultural sustainability and biodiversity. Those are all part of SDG2. SDG2, as you know, has 5 targets, and beans are critical and can be a tool to achieve all 5 targets. So recently, we launched a paper to really focus attention on the policy pathways to to both improve bean production and bean consumption, recognizing that governments have over the years, most governments have invested in beans. They are not a huge part of agriculture policy or nutrition policy. And so we pulled together a paper, mostly meant to be a conversation starter. At the Hub, we are conveners. We are not the technical experts. You all are the technical experts, and we have really engaged with our Science and Innovation Advisory Committee and other technical experts at FAO and in other places to pull together this paper as I said earlier, as a conversation starter to help us think through how we can get beans better represented in the policy realm. So there are three pathways that the paper proposes. One is really to take a whole of government approach. The second is to focus on public procurement, and the third is on how to support farmers. So I'll dive in a little bit to pathway one, which is taking a whole of government approach. And this, we also focused in this paper on policies at the global level, at the national level, and at the subnational level. At the global level, there are many areas in the last few years where beans could be very supportive for beans. The UN Food Systems Summit led to the call for governments to develop food systems transformation pathways. Many governments are in the process of doing that. That's an opportunity to engage on the potential of beans in terms of transforming food systems. Many governments are developing their plans on climate mitigation, the NDCs, as well as climate adaptation. Beans can be critical in that respect as well. And then you've got dietary guidelines coming out of WHO and FAO, definitions of what is a healthy diet. Governments are seeing these normative bodies really weigh into the healthy diets realm. And so these are all opportunities where advocates can really seize on how global policy is then being translated into national, subnational policy. At the regional level, we also have opportunities. The African Union has recently adopted the third iteration of its CAADP, the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program. That this is the next 10-year strategy for Africa. How can beans be integrated into the implementation of that strategy? I think is a really critical, it provides a critical opportunity for advocates as well as practitioners. And the CAADP program then will be translated into national plans. And so that's another opportunity on the continent to really engage with African governments on this. So in the paper, we call for I'll put the link to the paper in the chat when I'm done, but thanks for the question. The CAADP, so in the paper, we call for a whole of government approach, recognizing that beans impact nutrition, they have climate impact, but the challenges for beans are across various line ministries and across sectors. And so you need a whole of government approach, both to understand the opportunities, to address the challenges and the trade-offs, and to ensure that different line ministries see their role in advancing bean production and bean consumption. And then further to that, it's really important that beans are also reflected in budgetary allocations. Without the resources, you can't implement the policies. I'll move to policy pathway 2, which really builds on this whole of government approach and focuses on the role of public procurement. So next slide, please. So in the paper, we really delve into the importance of public procurement. Public procurement accounts for as much as 1 in every $3 spent by governments and is an estimated average of 12% of GDP for OECD countries and as much as 30% of GDP for developing countries. So public procurement is an immensely important lever to support bean production and bean consumption. In terms of production, public procurement rules can really be crafted in a way that bolster specific producers and methods of production. It can help increase the economic viability of producing beans by smallholder farmers in a way that would boost their incomes and promote economic development in rural communities. It can support it can support bean farmers to practice sustainable agricultural methods and boosting climate resilience and efficient use of water and land. And the regularity and predictability of demand can also enable smallholder farmers to make critical investments to increase and diversify their crops, which could include the adoption of beans, peas, pulses, and legumes. On the consumption side, public procurement is really important in addressing malnutrition. 1 in 3 people on the planet suffer from one form of malnutrition or another, and healthy diets remain unaffordable to 2.6 billion people on the planet. So thinking about how public procurement can address malnutrition is really critical. And we identify several sort of benefits of that, including access to nutrient-dense foods and dietary diversity, a shift in food consumption patterns from an over-reliance on animal-based proteins to plant-based proteins, cost savings in that respect as well. And we focus on several mechanisms. School meals, Jean-Claude mentioned PABRA is working very much with school meals programs. School meals programs have become a global priority. $48 billion are now invested in school meals, most of which come from government spending. 400 million children globally eat school meals every day. So incorporating more beans into school meals can help school authorities, caterers, chefs meet the protein requirements set by national dietary guidelines. School meals can also be tailored to national contexts, providing specific tastes and addressing cultural preferences, as well as sourcing from smallholder farmers. So school meals can be a real lever for change. The other big avenue is through social protection programs. Social protection programs are programs that help low-income communities meet their basic needs, including food insecurity. According to the World Bank, an average of 1.5% of GDP is invested in social protection every year. And social protection programs mostly are administered by government, but in countries or where that capacity is not there, UN agencies and others are working with government to meet these needs. So beans can be really scaled up through the design of these programs, ensuring that they're purchasing from and supporting local bean farmers, making sure that that underserved communities and food insecure communities have access to beans that are shelf stable and culturally appropriate, providing the right nutrition. And then another avenue is health systems, ensuring that beans are included in the ready-to-use supplementary foods and complementary foods to manage mild forms of malnutrition. In order to do all of this, we need a strong enabling environment that really encourages public procurement to be informed by national dietary guidelines, as well as ensuring that have the support to meet the requirements, the quality and the safety requirements of public procurement programs. And then finally, the third pathway that we talked about in the paper is really how you empower smallholder farmers. Agricultural extension is critical to help them understand the different varieties, the importance of intercropping, the research in terms of productivity yields, the margins, and the crop rotation options, and so on. We need to do more to invest in improved, organized, and predictable seed systems, and Jean-Claude spoke about that. We also need to strengthen the capacity of smallholder farmers to, as I said, meet the quality requirements in order to be able to engage in the public procurement process. And then finally, we need strong farmer organizations and cooperatives to help with aggregation and to better negotiate prices for farmers. And our research is really key, and to continue to invest in research to be able to translate evidence into real change at the ground level. So I'll stop there. I'll put the link to the paper in the chat. As I mentioned, it is very much a conversation starter, and look forward to, and each region is very different, as Donal and Jean-Claude's presentations really showed the different challenges in each region. So the policies in this paper is illustrative, but really meant to help really begin to contextualize and have a discussion of which policies would work in which environment. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Asma. That was great. Very informative. Sorry for the technical problem. I couldn't tell you how much time you had left, but you went great with the time management. So now we have Marin Vandamme talking. He has worked at McKinsey for 5 years, leading the development of agricultural strategies across East and West Africa. In 2025, he co-funded the Protein Project to help break Europe's food system out of policy gridlock by building alliances across the value chain and championing protein diversification as a pathway for climate, health, and economic opportunity. Welcome, Marin.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Let me share my screen, and mindful of time, I'll try to leave some time so that everyone has some Q&A time. So, well, as you were saying, we went from Europe to Africa to a more global perspective, and now we're actually going back to the EU. And Donal, thanks a lot for sharing a lot of interesting things. It'd be great to talk afterwards. But maybe to give you a bit of context, so as I was saying, I used to work at McKinsey for 5 years, but I think most interesting there is that I was helping develop national food and agricultural strategies. And the context there is, of course, incredibly different than in Europe, where there is, I worked for a year in Tanzania, there is a protein deficit in Tanzania, there is a calorie deficit. And so the narratives to unite people across the value chain and policymakers to actually move forward were relatively simple. And the challenges were large, but the sense of agreement on the direction was very much present. And then a year ago, I left the African context, left McKinsey and started a new organization. And I realized that discussions at EU level are not unsurprisingly, but completely different when it comes to protein questions. And they are complex, and very often it is a one side or the other story. Critics of animal production rightly talk about the climate impacts of the production system, the biodiversity loss, the huge impact on animal welfare, the health impacts of over-consuming, and more recently as well, important consideration on strategic autonomy, given that the EU imports a lot of its high protein feed from Brazil and the US. Now, on the other hand, you have people that are supporting of the current animal protein production and that refer to the importance of the system for rural jobs and income, for landscapes, the culinary cultures and tradition, for health, and the micronutrients that come with animal proteins, and also the important role of animal production for organic matter and general grazing systems. And it is an incredibly polarized landscape where those two narratives rarely meet and almost always find each other in opposition to each other, which, as we've seen in Europe, has led to significantly gridlock. We've seen the farm to fork, and of course, there's more than just a protein question, but it is one of the important ones that has just not been able to materialize despite a lot of momentum and political promise. And that's when we look at the broader meta narratives. But when you actually go and speak to farmers, and that's what we've done, you realize that a lot of farmers are very mindful of this, of those dual realities of there is a need to increase plants production, protein crop production. There's a need to rebalance our diets, and there's a need to make our animal production more sustainable. And it doesn't necessarily need to be an excluding story, but it can be a story that reinforces each other. And a few of those farmers, I think, are a great example. On the top right, we have Benedict, for example, who next to raising pigs also grows legumes and pulses for human consumption, arguing that for many reasons, we should be eating more legumes and pulses in Europe. There's also animal systems that can be much more sustainable, such as at the bottom left, Ruud is a farmer from the Netherlands, and they produce eggs, feeding their chickens only with industrial waste streams, meaning that food that would be thrown away otherwise actually allows to create new proteins. And there's a lot of stories. We gathered a dozen of them over a few months. And what you realize and the similarity of those stories across Europe is that many farmers are embracing these opportunities of protein diversification, but it is not simple. Very often they've taken significantly personal risk, put a lot of additional effort, and have made it work, but it is not straightforward to find easy, scalable business models for protein crops and more general protein diversification. And Donal was mentioning it earlier. Of course, the yield gap is one of the very important reasons as to why it is so difficult. And it's stuck within this minor crop category with little investment, therefore little improvement, therefore even less investment. However, for many reasons, we believe that it's so critical to support protein crops. And of course, that goes, I think Donal mentioned it, there might be a reduction of overall energy output. Supporting protein diversification also means rebalancing our diets. And therefore, if we manage to rebalance the share of plant-based and animal-based, there's also less need for energy production. And therefore, we can avoid some of those difficult trade-offs. But taking a step back, so we realize that actually, despite the polarization, there's a lot that's going on. There's a lot of pioneering farms across Europe that are embracing this, but it's very difficult to bring these methods to the European level and actually get things to move within the common agriculture policy, within the bioeconomy strategy, and within other policy files. And so from that experience over the last year, I've co-founded the Protein Project together with my co-founder Catherine, and then Manon is on the chat as well. And what we want to do is to unite Europe's food voices to seize the opportunity of protein diversification, realizing that it's so critical to show how this can benefit the entire value chain, how this can benefit farmers, rural communities, stakeholders across the value chain, but then also consumers and our planet. And we have three main activities in order to contribute to achieving that. As you can imagine, the EU is a very large machine, so it will take many people saying the same message over and over again and pushing for any change to happen. But the way that we are going at it is a threefold approach. So the first thing that we do, and I'll go more into detail later because that's the more relevant for this call, is actually to develop industrial roadmaps where we bring together the value chain, assess challenges for a specific commodity, and then come up with solutions. The second element is to try to broaden the discussion on protein diversification to a broader political spectrum. Historically, a lot of the arguments for protein diversification, for protein transition, for vegetarian veganism have come from what is considered the progressive left. And that is not the winning or dominating power in the EU at the moment. So the question is, how can we also show that thinking about how we produce and consume proteins is actually a priority for all parties? And that includes reflecting on, well, what is the role of protein diversification for rural incomes, for farmers, for our competitiveness in biotech and bioeconomy, for our healthcare system, for strategic autonomy, even more so given recent geopolitical events. And then last but not least, how do you translate this to a political momentum? How do you get past the polarization? And we believe the best way to do is actually to bring people together in closed-door discussion from different political parties in order to be able to exchange on a path forward to propose and implement policies that eventually increase and improve the system for everyone. Now that is a high level what we're doing. Could spend much more time on that, but I think the most relevant today is the industrial roadmap, because the first industrial roadmap that we are developing is on fava beans, with the idea that, and very similar, so I won't go too much into detail, but taking a bit what Donal was saying is it's a minor crop, there's low demands, limited investments, it's a low margin production with low yields, and there's therefore limited marketing. And we are in a vicious circle that makes it very hard to have a scalable business model on fava beans, but on a lot of the leguminous crops that is sustainable financially over time. And so if you want to break that, we believe that it will not be done by a siloed approach. It's not only about research and development. It's not only about better techniques on the farm, and it's also not about better processing and about more demands. It is about elevating all of that at the same time and have a value chain approach. And so that's exactly what we are doing. So we brought, 4 months ago, we brought 20 stakeholders from across the value chain together. So that is input providers, farmers, different types, conventional, organic, regenerative, as well as transformers, distributors, civil society, and retailers to jointly assess, well, what is the current bottleneck? What are the bottlenecks across the value chain? And then starting to look at the solutions, policy solution that would support the private sector, the value chain to develop themselves. And we're in the midst of doing that. So I would say a call to anyone, if you feel like you would like to share some input on that, please feel free to send me an email, add me on LinkedIn. We would welcome as much input as possible. But as I said, at the moment, we are finalizing the solution and looking at the policy vehicles to bring them into life. And then afterwards, we're in discussion with a few research centers to actually quantify some of that impact. If those policies are implemented, what would it mean for farmer income? What would it mean? Donal, you show an example already, but for example, on our fertilizer use, what would it mean on strategic autonomy and so forth, so that we have a comprehensive document with challenges, solutions, and an impact that can be used as a policy document to push for change. And again, the policy document doesn't come from anywhere. It's really brought together by the value chain and supported by it. I will not go into detail. This is more a slide to read, but it's more to show you the approach. So we started identifying challenges, as I said, across from research and innovation, farming, transformation, market, and then also challenges across the entire value chain. And once we had validated those challenges, I'm very happy to share the slides afterwards, we actually started to identify, and that's the stage where we are, solutions that can help to increase production and consumption of fava beans in Europe. It's important that a lot of we've taken fava beans, here taking a step back, we've taken fava beans in order to have a very concrete crop to work with. But of course, a lot of the recommendations relate and would impact all leguminous crops. Now, the solutions that we see at the moment, and starting from the farmers, is of course to ensure that they have the inputs, tool, and knowledge to successfully increase their yields in different production methods. Then we also need to ensure that farming legumes, farming fava beans, is not only about the fava bean, but it's also about the societal benefits that are provided. So it's important that farmers are rewarded for it. Then lastly, on the farm level, we've also seen that the largest success stories of farmer benefiting from growing fava beans is actually when they are organized and that they can improve their production, processing abilities, and when they are well connected with the entire value chain. The Dutch protein farmers is a good example of models that can help to scale the production of protein crops. Then on the fourth solution, it's important to have clear regulation because at the moment there's still uncertainty sometimes on the use for fava beans, food and feeds, which would, with true better regulation, increase its versatility. Then really critical in the middle of the chain is infrastructure, storage, distribution, processing, and ensuring that the infrastructure is developed around cluster of production. And then we move to the consumption. There's two parts of the consumption. I would say I consume without knowing, and I consume very much as a concrete choice. So the first one, and it relates to the previous presentation, it's public procurement, among others. How do we ensure that fava beans, but more generally legumes and pulses, are well served within food services across the EU? And then last but not least, how do you also ensure that it's actually a very conscious choice of consumers through public marketing campaign? And the EU has 200 million euros dedicated to marketing of agricultural products. How can a portion of that be used, among others, to ensure that Europeans are well aware of the benefits of fava beans and therefore increase their habits of buying and eating them? But knowing the benefits also goes to how do I cook them, what works for me, and so forth and so forth. So that's in a nutshell what we've been doing. I've tried to go quite quickly through it, mindful of time, but as I said, what would be super valuable for us, if very happy to have chats with any of you that would want to share anything. We are still a few months away from publishing the roadmap, so very welcome for any input. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marin. That was a great presentation. Now we can move on to our discussion. If anyone wants to ask a question, you can raise your hands. It's just clicking on the reacting and raising your hands. And also the speakers, I know you might have a question to one another, you can also do that. Sometimes people don't like to talk on the meeting, so if you also want to send your questions on the chat, feel free to do that. Well, Marin, maybe we need to break the ice. Do you want to ask something for Donal? If you have a similar interest?
Yes, but that would probably take a full hour, so I don't know if That's the best use of everyone's time. But
Mhm.
I think the value of those calls for us at least is also connecting and seeing what everyone is doing and making sure that we're not working in silos and can build on each other's work.
Nicolas, do you want to talk? It was just a reaction of okay, good. Asma, do
Yeah,
you
I
want to
guess
share?
I have a question maybe for you, Marin. In terms of how are you going to document your efforts? I mean, how do we all learn from what you're trying to do in Europe?
Yes, thanks you, Asma. So the way that we'll do it is we'll publish it into a report style that's, as I said, because our end audience is very much policymakers, it'll be targeted to EU policymakers. And I believe we are planning by end of November around to be done with the roadmap, and then it will be publicly available. So yeah, that's hopefully that can be helpful. And then based on that, of course, if there's follow-up disseminations, another chat where we go more into detail, always happy to make sure we can build on each other's work.
Thank you. I had a question for Donal as well, if I can. Donal, it felt like, I mean, the challenges are quite huge competing with wheat. And so if you had to, I mean, say what needs to happen in the sort of short, medium, and long term in terms of, as advocates, where would one put the energy? Um, yeah, any thoughts and advice there?
You're on
Yeah.
mute. Yeah.
That's a really good question. The main way forward at the moment to redress the balance uh, between the cereals and the crops that dominate European agriculture and others is through plant breeding. Now, that is a long-term solution. In the meantime, there is agronomy and other things, and approaches that we just Marin just discussed to keep things growing somewhat. It's a really tricky, and of course, the short-term way is to subsidize minor crops. Now, that's a tricky one because, as I suggested towards the end of my talk, when you subsidize options which are, for some reason, not favored by farmers, you might end up subsidizing production which is less productive than what farmers otherwise would do, and the result is, at the global level, is a downside somewhere. So it's a really it's a really tricky question. I think there are cases where farmers seem to overlook the potential of crop diversification at farm level and finding alternatives to those places where wheat or the other crops don't grow well. And another thing is, this is a general one, is that our systems are too intense. Farmers, I think, in some cases, are overcooking their production systems. They have overdone it. And a good example of that is the use of clover and grass in Ireland. I come from Ireland, by the way. The use of grass and clover in Ireland is struggling because farmers actually are too strongly channeled onto maximum production. Not even economic optimum production, as maximum production. So there's a number of ways. It's not an easy one.
Well, we got some questions in the chat and we have some raised hands. I think the first one was Eva. She's asked Donal, what are the policymakers thinking or planning about the reduction in land use for meat production and convert to grain legume production?
Well, they're not think. I don't mean this unkindly, but they're not thinking because it's the market, stupid. You know, it's the economy, stupid, as Bill Clinton once said. The EU meat food system is characterized by a strong balance between consumption and production of meat. You know, farmers complain that there's imports and so on from different places, but actually, at the European level, production of meats and consumption of meats are balanced, generally balanced. The amount of imports and exports are relatively small to places like New Zealand or some beef from Brazil. So, you know, the meat has to come from somewhere if the consumer demands it. Now, policymakers are very, very slowly adopting a more integrated food systems approach. I'm going to go to Vienna tomorrow to advocate for, to help advocate for a protein strategy for Europe, which is a protein strategy, not just a strategy for protein crops. We need a protein strategy in Europe, not a protein crop strategy. And we need, I strongly advocate for protein balances to be calculated for each country. Protein balances that include the meat and the plant-based proteins being consumed. Protein balance for every country, just like we have carbon balances. And that, I think, will help neutralize the debate that Marin was talking about, this polarized debate, that we talk about facts and the reality of how we acquire and use protein that nobody can dispute, free of ideology and free of picking technical solutions.
Well, now I'm going to let Wolfgang ask, since he's a participant.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. I have a question to Marin. Why did you choose fava beans? To my knowledge, in the Weltacker in Bern, they are full of pests and are very difficult to cultivate. And the pests are from beginning of their growth. So how?
Yeah.
What do you think? Yes.
I'm very happy to answer that question. And so the way we did is we had selected the 10 protein crops. Well, not surprising, the same one as Donal showed earlier. And we had some sort of form of prioritization based on the maturity of the value chain. One thing to also, if it's too mature, we think, for example, Donal soja already plays a good role to support it. So it might not benefit from the same work that we're doing. And maybe a crop like lupin is not mature enough and doesn't have enough developed value chain. So that's one of the things we looked at. Another one was suitability across Europe. And so fava beans is a good one because it's grown both in Ireland as well as in Spain, Eastern and Western Europe. And what you mentioned is correct, especially in part of Germany and France, the bean beetle can be a huge issue. And there's been markets that have been lost because of that. But typically, for example, that beetle is less present around the North Sea. So Denmark, part of the UK, northern of Germany actually has pretty high yields. And then it's also way less present in the south. So that's one of the reasons that in the end, there's no perfect crop. But that's why we chose fava beans. It was also very good from a sustainability perspective, not too many allergens, quite a lot of usage, versatility of usage. So that's been, and we'll document that in our plan. And then maybe I'll just take a moment because I'll need to leave soon. But in terms of, Asma, you asked a question on what needs to happen on the production, but I think your whole presentation also, it's so important for things to happen on consumption, because a good example is in the Netherlands. Not so long ago, they had increased the eco schemes for a certain type of legumes. I don't remember which one. And the result was that the next year there was overproduction of it and there was no demand. And then there was too many of it and then farmers actually made losses. So we really need to make sure that consumption follows as well and that there's policies and campaign that support that. And then, yeah, Donal, good to hear on the protein plan of the EU. That's something that we advocate for as well. And Commissioner Hansen has mentioned that they're going to work on a comprehensive protein plan. But historically, a lot of the protein plans in the EU have focused exclusively on feeds and only on the production and not consumption. So I'm really happy. I think a lot of people joining voices to say we need a really comprehensive plan looking at all sorts of protein plans, animal, but also novel, and really have a value chain approach. So that's, I would say, what we also collectively try to move in Europe. And then there's also additional voices that are calling for plant-based action plan, building also on some of the learnings of Denmark.
Okay, thanks a lot.
JJ, got your hand raised?
Yeah, that's
Jean-Claude.
JC. I don't know how they changed to JJ. Yeah, thanks.
Mhm.
Maybe my question is to all the three other colleagues who presented. I'm sure maybe in the history, Europe was a big consumer of pulses. Maybe I just is an assumption. So, what could Africa or other countries do to avoid a big shift toward only animal proteins or even abandoning the pulses? What could be the researchers do? What could be the policy makers do? What could be the consumer do, or what can be done for the consumer to continue? In Africa, the consumption it's actually going up. Of course, it may link to incomes, may link to cultural habit, but it may change one day or another. So what could be, what can we do to avoid leaving behind our cultural food and highly nutritious and healthy? Yeah.
I'll take a stab at that.
Yeah, sure.
This is one thing I would, if I ruled the world, I would advocate be very careful about the activities of the supermarkets in a country. They really impact on the food system and decide what is offered. And once you have those multiple retailers like Asda or Walmart, they will go into a country and they will change the way people interact with the food system in whatever direction they want it to happen. I see this in China. The second thing is that you need a strong public dietary guidelines that are well publicized and that avoid, that really grasp the nettle, grasp the issue. Even in today in Europe, the public dietary guidelines are beating around the issue. They're not really addressing it head on. And so you need strong dietary guidelines, and you need to get a grip on the retailers.
Right. Okay.
Asma or Marin, do you also want to reply to that or no?
That was a terrific answer.
I think, yeah. Yeah, I think a lot has been said. I would maybe just add one thing is there's also sometimes, and it's changing, but this idea of, a world basket, a world diet, I think luckily increasingly there's really this recognition of regional healthy baskets and recognizing that and being proud of that. When I was working in Tanzania, some of the local crops, that was something that really proud of the cuisine. And I feel like that might be something that can help to keep beans on the agenda, if you want, because indeed in Europe we've lost our beans, and now it's about finding them back, and it's easier to keep something than losing it and finding it again. And yeah, supermarkets as well. Work with them or watch out.
Asma?
Marin's answer made me think of something else. I think there's a huge, I mean, we live in a different time now where, you know, we face so many interconnected challenges. So I think there is potential to help policymakers see, you know, see the value in approaches or yeah, in beans where you're addressing multiple challenges that they are trying to address. So, I mean, I think Jean-Claude, in Africa, there is a clear value in you know, promoting the adoption of crops that are, you know, helping to adapt to climate change, lifting smallholders out of poverty, addressing the nutrition challenge. I think thinking about sort of the costs of not doing those things versus the cost of helping farmers, you know, improve the productivity of their bean production is really, I think, something that policymakers are not necessarily doing that calculus. What is the cost of inaction or cost of not adopting these approaches versus, yeah, just focusing on yields and the commodities that lead to the highest yields.
I mean, maybe also I'm thinking that as we work with, we don't have to fear the big supermarket. Should we work with them? Because that's a reality which is difficult to deal with as well. That's number one. Number two, I mean, I like the policies, but it takes time, or sometimes a government comes in, another government after 4 years, and the whole thing collapses. So, I mean, I like the policy, but on the other hand, we need really, how do we incentivize the consumer to be the one demanding the products they are looking for? And then how do we incentivize the farmer to make sure he gets return on their investment? They get return on their investment. That's, I think, where the bottlenecks may lie. So if we're able to work with the consumer to demand the product, and then that means working on consumer trade, which the emerging consumer are looking for, and then keep them in that product. But at the same time, translate that into incentive of the farmer, productivity plus consumer trade, which are people are willing to pay for it. That can keep, in my view, can keep the value chain working. But I don't know. That is again a theory we may want to prove. Yeah.
Well, our time is over, but this conversation could go on forever. Thank you so much for everyone that was here. I'm gonna ask the speakers if they want to share any materials, and I'll share it in our newsletter in the middle of the month. And thank you so much for all of you that spoke and all of you that came.
Thanks so much for organizing and
Thank you.
moderating.
Thank you.